My ex-wife's new husband kept driving through my garden, destroying my flowers. I spoke to my ex-wife, but she laughed and said, "Men will be men. My new husband is a real man." One morning, I woke up to find my entire yard trampled and my fence cut down. Furious, I set a trap. The next night, I heard screaming, and when my ex-wife saw what I had done, she nearly fainted. I stood there on my front porch, coffee mug warming my hands, staring out at the little patch of earth I turned into something beautiful over the past few years. My garden was my pride, my quiet corner of the world after everything fell apart with Clarissa. The divorce had been messy, years of arguments, tears, and her walking out the door with half my life in her suitcase. But I'd found peace here in this sleepy Illinois suburb, just me and my flowers. Roses, tulips, daisies, all of them growing strong under my care. A little fence I built myself, keeping it all safe. It wasn't much, but it was mine. That peace lasted right up until the day I saw the moving truck 3 houses down. I didn't think much of it at first, just new neighbors, probably some nice folks looking for a quiet life like me. Then I saw her step out of the passenger side, flipping her hair like she always did when she was trying to look important. Clarissa, my ex-wife. My stomach dropped. She'd moved into my cul-de-sac like some kind of cruel joke from the universe. Then came Rick. I didn't know his name yet, but I saw him climb out of the driver's seat. A big guy, broad shoulders, buzzed hair, the kind of man who looked like he'd spend his life barking orders. His truck was one of those oversized monsters, all chrome and noise, the kind you'd expect from someone who needed everyone to notice him. I watched them unpack, hoping maybe they'd keep to themselves. But hope's a funny thing. It doesn't last long when reality kicks in. A few days later, I was out watering my roses when I heard that truck roar to life. I glanced up just in time to see Rick peel out of their driveway, cut the corner sharp, and roll right over the edge of my lawn. The tires left deep ruts in the grass, tearing up the green I'd spent months keeping neat. I stood there, hose dripping in my hand, jaw tight. It wasn't the garden yet, just the grass, but it felt like a warning. It happened again the next week, then the week after that. Each time, he'd swing that truck wide, leaving tire marks like scars across my yard. I'd grit my teeth and fix it, telling myself it wasn't worth a fight. But then one Saturday morning, I was kneeling in the dirt, planting some new marigolds when I heard the rumble. Before I could even stand, Rick's truck came barreling straight through my garden. The front tires crushed my roses. The back ones flattened the tulips, petals scattered everywhere. Stems snapped like bones. I shot to my feet, heart pounding, fist clenched. He didn't even slow down, just kept going, windows down, laughing like it was some big game. I looked over at their house and saw Clarissa on the porch, sipping something from a glass, smirking at me like she used to when she knew she'd won an argument. I couldn't take it anymore. I marched across the street, dirt still on my knees, and stopped at the edge of their driveway. "Hey," I called out, voice shaking with anger. Rick climbed out of his truck, all swagger, wiping his hands on his jeans like he'd just done some real work. Clarissa stayed where she was, watching me with that same smug look. "You mind keeping your truck off my property?" I said, trying to keep it civil. Rick just grinned, showing too many teeth. "What's the big deal, man? It's just some flowers." I felt my blood boil. "It's my garden. I've been working on it for years. You don't get to roll through it like it's nothing." He laughed, a loud, barking sound, and looked over at Clarissa like I was some kind of clown. She finally spoke, her voice dripping with that old familiar venom. "Oh, Marcus, lighten up. Men will be men. Rick's a real man. Not like some people." I stood there, staring at her, feeling that old sting. A real man. She'd thrown that at me during the divorce too, like I was less because I didn't strut around breaking things to prove a point. Rick clapped a hand on his truck, still chuckling. "Maybe you should get a tougher hobby, buddy. Flowers? That's cute." I didn't say anything else. I just turned and walked back to my house, jaw so tight it hurt. I could hear them laughing behind me, the sound cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. When I got inside, I slammed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. My garden, what was left of it, was a mess. Crushed petals, broken stems, tire tracks slicing through it like a wound. I'd spent years building that little piece of peace, and in one morning, they'd torn it apart. I looked out the window at their house, at that stupid truck parked like it owned the street, and something shifted in me. This wasn't just about flowers anymore. This was personal. They wanted to push me? Fine. I'd push back, not with yelling or fists. I wasn't Rick. I'd do it my way. I didn't know how yet. But standing there, staring at the wreckage of my sanctuary, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I woke up every Saturday after that with a knot in my gut, waiting for the sound of Rick's truck. It became a routine I hated. Me sipping coffee on the porch, pretending everything was fine, while my eyes kept darting to their house 3 doors down. Sure enough, like clockwork, I'd hear that engine rev up, loud and obnoxious, and there he'd go. Rick would peel out of their driveway, swing wide, and tear right through my yard again. The first few times, it was just the grass, but now he'd gotten bolder. He'd aim for the garden itself, tires chewing up what was left of my flowers, leaving mud and broken stems in his wake. I'd stand there, gripping my mug so tight I thought it might crack, watching him roar off down the street like he owned the whole damn neighborhood. And there was Clarissa every time, perched on their porch with a drink in her hand, watching it all like it was her favorite show. She'd wave at me sometimes, that little smirk on her face, like she was daring me to do something about it. I tried talking to them again. Stupid, I know, but I thought maybe I could reason with them. One afternoon, after he'd flattened my daisies, I walked over, hands shoved in my pockets so I wouldn't do something dumb like swing at him. Rick was leaning against his truck, wiping down the hood like it was a prize horse. Clarissa sat on the steps, swirling ice in her glass. Hey, I started keeping my voice steady. I'm asking you again. Keep that thing off my yard. It's not a racetrack. Rick didn't even look up, just kept polishing. It's just a little fun, man. Relax. Fun. That word hit me like a slap. It's not fun for me, I said. That garden's mine. I put years into it. You're wrecking it for no reason. He finally straightened up, towering over me with that smug grin. It's just dirt and petals, Marcus. Maybe if you had something worth protecting, I'd care. I felt my face heat up, but before I could snap back, Clarissa chimed in. He's asserting his manhood, she said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. You wouldn't get it. Asserting his manhood. I wanted to laugh, but all I could feel was the rage bubbling up inside me. I walked away again that day, their laughter chasing me back to my house. Every time I tried to stand up for myself, they turned it into a joke. I'd patch up the garden as best I could, replant what I could save, smooth out the ruts, but it wasn't the same. The neat rows were gone, the fence was leaning, and every fix felt like a band-aid on a broken leg. I started avoiding my own front yard just so I wouldn't have to see the damage, but I couldn't avoid the sound. Every weekend, that truck. Every weekend, their mocking voices. Rick started yelling stuff when he drove by nice weeds, buddy, or grow a pair, flower boy. And Clarissa would cackle like it was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying it all in my head. It wasn't just the garden anymore. It was the way they looked at me, like I was nothing, like I'd always been nothing to her. Then came the morning that broke me. I'd stayed up late the night before, working on a new section of the garden, trying to bring it back to life. I'd rebuilt the wooden fence by hand, hammering each plank into place, feeling a little bit of pride creep back in. I went to bed tired but hopeful. When I woke up, I shuffled outside with my coffee, expecting to see my work still standing. Instead, I froze. The garden was gone. Not just damaged, destroyed. Every plant was uprooted, stomped flat, or torn out. The fence I'd spent hours on was kicked in, splintered wood scattered everywhere. Deep tire tracks ran through the middle, and I could still smell the exhaust hanging in the air. It looked like a war zone, like some monster had ripped through it just to spite me. I dropped my mug, coffee splashing on my boots, and just stood there, chest tight, hands shaking. I didn't need to guess who did it. I could hear Rick's truck idling down the street, and when I looked up, there he was, leaning out the window with that same stupid grin. Oops, he called out, then gunned the engine and took off. Clarissa was on the porch again, laughing so hard she nearly spilled her drink. I didn't move for a long time. I just stared at the mess, my mess now. The last thing I had, the one thing I'd held on to after she left me, was gone. It wasn't just dirt and petals to me, it was every quiet morning I'd spent out there. Every hour I'd poured into making something good out of the wreckage she'd left behind, and they'd taken it just because they could. I walked back inside, slammed the door, and sank into a chair, my mind racing. I wasn't going to beg them anymore. I wasn't going to yell or reason or play their game. They thought they could walk all over me, literally, and get away with it. They thought I'd just take it, like I always had with her. But not this time. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but as I sat there, staring at my muddy boots, a fire started burning in me. This wasn't about flowers anymore. This was about them thinking they could break me and laugh while they did it. I wasn't broken yet, and I wasn't going to let them win. I'd find a way to make them regret this. I'd make sure of it. I couldn't sleep that night after they trashed my garden. I kept seeing it every time I closed my eyes. The smashed flowers, the broken fence, the tire tracks cutting through it all like a knife. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with anger and something else, something sharper. I wasn't just going to fix it this time. I wasn't going to let Rick and Clarissa keep laughing at me like I was some pushover they could stomp on whenever they felt like it. By the time the sun came up, I'd made up my mind. I needed a plan, something smart, something that'd hit them where it hurt without me ever throwing a punch. I didn't have Rick's size or Clarissa's venom, but I had my head, and I was going to use it. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Cal Benton's name. If anyone could help me pull this off, it was him. Cal was an old friend from way back, before Clarissa, before the divorce, when life was simpler. He lived out in the sticks now, a farmer with a knack for tinkering. He'd built all kinds of weird stuff over the years. Contraptions for his crops, gadgets to scare off crows, even a little robot dog once, just for laughs. I hadn't talked to him in a while, but he owed me a favor from a few summers ago when I'd helped him haul hay after his truck broke down. I dialed his number, pacing my kitchen, the wrecked garden glaring at me through the window. "Marcus Shaw, you old dog," Cal answered, his voice rough and cheerful. "What's got you calling me at the crack of dawn?" I didn't waste time. "I need your help, Cal. My ex-wife's new husband's been tearing up my yard, and I'm done taking it. I want to set something up, something to stop him cold." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "Sounds like a man's crossed a line. Tell me what you're thinking." I laid it out. How Rick kept driving through my garden. How Clarissa egged him on. How they destroyed everything I'd built. Cal listened, grunting now and then, and when I finished, he didn't hesitate. "I've got just the thing," he said. "You ever hear of a perimeter, Matt? Farmers use them to keep cows from wandering. Low voltage won't kill anybody, but it'll make 'em wish they'd stayed home. I've got one I can tweak for you." My ears perked up. "What else you got?" He laughed again. "How about motion sprinklers? Freezing cold water hits them the second they step where they shouldn't. And, oh, you'll love this, a motion speaker. I rigged one up with a sound that'll scare the devil himself. Part demon, part hellhound, loud as sin. They'll think the gates of hell opened up." I could feel a grin creeping across my face. "That's perfect, Cal. Can you get it to me quick?" "Give me a day to round it up," he said. "I'll drop it off tomorrow. You owe me a beer after this, though." "Deal?" I said, already feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Cal showed up the next afternoon, his beat-up truck rattling into my driveway. He climbed out, wiry and sunburned, hauling a box of gear that clinked and rattled. "Here's your revenge kit," he said, setting it down with a thud. He walked me through it. The mat was a thin, rubbery thing I could bury under a layer of dirt wired to a little battery pack. The sprinklers were small but tough, easy to hide in the flower beds. And the speaker, he hooked it up to his phone and played the sound for me. It was a deep, guttural roar, like something out of a nightmare, loud enough to wake the whole street. "They'll crap their pants," Cal said, grinning. I nodded, picturing Rick's smug face turning to panic. "Let's hope so." We spent the rest of the day setting it up. I dug shallow trenches along the edge of my yard, laid the mat down, and covered it with soil so it looked like nothing was there. The sprinklers went in next, tucked behind what was left of my plants, aimed right at the path Rick always took. The speaker I hid under the porch angled so the sound would blast out toward the street. Cal wired it all to motion sensors. Step on the mat, and the whole show would start. I added one more thing, my old security cameras. I bought them cheap a while back, mostly to watch for package thieves, but now they'd be my eyes. I mounted one on the porch, another by the garage, both aimed at the yard. If Rick tried anything, I'd have proof. By the time we finished, the sun was setting, and my little house looked normal again. Except now it was a trap waiting to spring. Cal clapped me on the shoulder. "You're a patient man, Marcus, but even patient men got limits. This'll teach him." I thanked him, handed him a cold beer from the fridge, and sent him on his way. Then I went inside, grabbed a fresh mug of coffee, and settled into a chair by the window. It was dark out, the street quiet, but I wasn't going to bed. I wanted to be awake when Rick made his next move. I knew he'd come. Weekends were his time to shine, and he wouldn't be able to resist tearing through my yard again, especially after wrecking it so bad. I sat there, sipping my coffee, the bitterness matching the fire in my chest. Every creak of the house, every rustle outside, had me on edge. I kept imagining it, his truck rolling up, the tires hitting the mat, the chaos that'd follow. I wasn't a violent guy, never had been. But this wasn't about violence. This was about taking back what was mine, about showing them I wasn't the weak little man they thought I was. My garden was gone, sure, but my pride wasn't. I glanced at the cameras on my phone, their little green lights blinking in the dark. Everything was ready. All I had to do was wait. And as the night stretched on, that wait turned into something satisfying, like the calm before a storm you know is coming. They'd pushed me too far, and now they were going to find out what happens when I push back. I'd been sitting by the window for hours, the coffee in my mug long gone cold, when I finally saw it. Headlights cutting through the dark. It was 2 a.m. The street dead quiet except for the low growl of Rick's truck creeping closer. My heart started pounding, not out of fear, but something else. Anticipation. Maybe even excitement. I'd spent all day setting up my trap with Cal, and now it was time to see if it worked. I leaned forward, peering through the blinds, watching that oversized beast of a vehicle roll down the cul-de-sac. Rick didn't even try to be subtle. He swung wide, just like always, aiming straight for my yard. I held my breath as the front tires crossed the line, hitting the spot where I'd buried the mat. Then it happened. Zap. A sharp crackle split the air, faint but unmistakable, and the truck jerked like it had hit a wall. Rick's voice cut through the night, a high-pitched yelp that didn't match his big man swagger at all. Before he could figure out what was going on, the sprinklers kicked in. I'd aimed them just right, and now they blasted freezing water straight at his truck, spraying through the open windows. I could hear him cursing, loud and frantic, as the cold hit him. The demon roar came next. Cal's speaker let loose that ungodly sound, a deep, guttural howl that echoed off the houses like some monster had clawed its way out of hell. It was louder than I'd expected, rattling my windows, and I saw Rick's truck swerve hard, tires spinning in the wet dirt. He was yelling something I couldn't make out, probably swearing up a storm, and I couldn't help it. I grinned. The chaos was beautiful. Mud flew everywhere as he tried to peel out, the truck fishtailing like a panicked animal. Then I saw movement at their house. Clarissa came stumbling out onto the porch wrapped in a robe, her hair a mess. She must have heard the noise and figured Rick needed her. She took 2 steps off the porch, barefoot, and hit the mat herself a zap. She screamed, a wild, shrieking sound, hopping around like she'd stepped on a live wire. "Rick, what the hell is this?" she hollered, her voice cracking as the sprinklers caught her too, soaking her from head to toe. I couldn't stay inside anymore. I grabbed my jacket, slipped on my boots, and stepped out onto the porch, keeping my face calm like I'd just woken up to check on the commotion. The scene in front of me was better than I'd dreamed. Rick was half out of his truck, one leg stuck in the mud, water dripping off his buzzed head, his shirt plastered to his chest. Clarissa was a soggy mess, clutching her robe, shivering and glaring at everything like the world had personally betrayed her. The roar had stopped. The speaker was on a timer, but the sprinklers kept going, spitting icy water in little bursts. I crossed my arms and leaned against the railing, letting the silence settle for a second before I spoke. "Problems?" I said, keeping my voice even, like I was just a concerned neighbor. Rick whipped his head around, his face red and furious, but he didn't say anything right away. He was too busy trying to yank his boot out of the muck. Clarissa, though, she didn't miss a beat. She stormed toward me, slipping a little on the wet grass, pointing a dripping finger in my face. "What did you do, Marcus? This is insane. We're calling the police." I didn't flinch. I'd been waiting for that threat, and I was ready. "Please do," I said, meeting her eyes. "I've got security footage of you two destroying my property for weeks. Cops might like to see it." That stopped her cold. Her mouth opened, then shut, and I could see the gears turning behind those angry eyes. Rick finally got free of the mud and stomped over. His fists balled up like he wanted to take a swing. "You think you're smart?" he growled, water still trickling down his neck. "Setting up some little booby trap? You're pathetic." I shrugged, not moving an inch. "I think it's pretty smart, actually. You should try staying on your own side of the street next time." He took a step closer, chest puffed out, but Clarissa grabbed his arm. "Rick, don't," she hissed, her voice low but sharp. "He's not worth it." She was dripping wet, her robe clinging to her, and for once, she didn't look so smug. They stood there, glaring at me, and I just stared back, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. The cameras were rolling, the trap had worked, and for the first time since they'd moved in, I wasn't the one on the defensive. Rick muttered something under his breath, probably a curse, and turned back to his truck, kicking at the mud like it had personally offended him. Clarissa gave me one last venomous look before she followed, her slippers squishing with every step. "This isn't over," she called over her shoulder, but it sounded hollow, like she wasn't so sure anymore. I watched them go, the truck limping back to their driveway, leaving a trail of water and defeat. I stayed on the porch a while longer, letting the night air cool me down, the sprinklers finally clicking off behind me. The yard was a mess again, mud and tire marks, but it didn't matter. This wasn't about the garden tonight. This was about showing them I wasn't going to roll over anymore. I went back inside, locked the door, and pulled up the camera footage on my phone. There it was, clear as day: Rick driving in, the mat zapping him, the sprinklers soaking him, Clarissa's little dance when she hit the trap too. I saved it all, every second, and leaned back in my chair. They could call the cops if they wanted. I'd love to see them try to explain this. For now, though, I'd won. Not the war, maybe, But this battle? This one was mine. I set the phone down, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and sat there in the quiet, savoring the taste of it. The night wasn't over yet, and neither was this fight. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was the one holding the cards. Let him come at me again. I'd be ready. I woke up the next morning feeling lighter than I had in weeks, the memory of Rick and Clarissa flailing in my trap still fresh in my mind. I'd slept hard, the kind of sleep you get when you know you've landed a good punch, even if it wasn't with my fists. The sun was just creeping over the rooftops as I stepped onto the porch with my coffee, expecting to see the muddy mess from last night. It was there, sure, tire tracks and puddles, but something else caught my eye. Rick's truck was parked crooked in their driveway, still streaked with dirt, and I could see him through their front window, pacing back and forth like a caged bear. Clarissa was nowhere in sight, probably still fuming in her soggy robe. I smirked into my mug. They'd threatened to call the cops, but the street was quiet. No sirens, no flashing lights. They backed off, at least for now. I didn't have long to enjoy it though. Around noon, a car pulled up in front of my house. A sleek black sedan, the kind that screams lawyer or bill collector. A guy in a cheap suit stepped out, clipboard in hand, and marched up my walkway. I met him at the door before he could knock. "Marcus Shaw?" he asked, voice flat. "That's me," I said, keeping my tone easy. He handed me a piece of paper, official looking with a bunch of legal gibberish typed across it. "Cease and desist order," he said. "From Richard Dalton. Says you're harassing him with dangerous devices on your property. You've got 24 hours to remove them, or he's filing charges." I took the paper, glancing at the words, trespass, liability, damages. Rick's name was scrawled at the bottom in a big, sloppy signature. I almost laughed. "Thanks," I told the guy, and he nodded, turned, and left without another word. I shut the door and read it over, my good mood souring. Harassment? Dangerous devices? That was rich, coming from the guy who'd been treating my yard like his personal demolition derby. I tossed the letter on the table and grabbed my phone, pulling up the footage from last night. There it was, Rick driving onto my property, the mat zapping him, the sprinklers soaking him, private land, clear trespassing. If anyone had a case, it was me. I wasn't taking anything down. Let him try to push this. I'd shove it right back in his face. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. Rick didn't strike me as the type to let a little zap and some water stop him, and Clarissa was too stubborn to let me have the last word. I figured they'd lick their wounds for a day or two, then come at me again. I was right, just not in the way I expected. It started small that evening. I was out front, cleaning up the mud from the night before when I noticed something off. A couple of ketchup packets were stuck to one of my garden gnomes, the kind you get from fast food joints, smeared red across its little hat. I frowned, picked them up, and tossed them in the trash, thinking maybe some kid had dropped them. Then, the next morning, I found empty beer cans jammed into what was left of my flower beds, 3 of them crumpled and stinking of stale booze. I stood there, hands on my hips, staring at them. This wasn't random. Kids don't sneak around planting cans like that. I checked the cameras, nothing clear, just shadows moving in the dark, too far off to make out a face. My gut told me it was Rick, though. He wasn't dumb enough to drive through again, not after last night. But this was petty enough to be him. It got worse over the next few days. One night, I came home from the hardware store to find garbage scattered across my lawn. Banana peels, coffee grounds, some wrappers, like someone had emptied a trash bag and run off. The next morning, I stepped outside and gagged. Someone had dumped a pile of used cat litter right by my porch steps. The smell hit me like a punch, sour and sharp, and I had to grab a shovel to scoop it into a bag before I could even get to my mailbox. I checked the cameras again. Still nothing solid. Just a flicker of movement near the edge of the frame. Whoever it was knew where the blind spots were, and that made my blood run hot. Rick had been watching, figuring out how to dodge my setup. I could picture him snickering about it, Clarissa egging him on with that smirk of hers, thinking they'd found a new way to get under my skin. I wasn't wrong about them brooding, either. Every time I saw Rick outside, he'd glare at me across the street, his jaw tight, his big shoulders hunched like he was holding himself back. Clarissa kept her distance, but I'd catch her on their porch sometimes, staring at my house with those cold eyes, sipping her drink like she was plotting. They weren't yelling anymore, weren't mocking me to my face, but this quiet revenge was worse. It was sneaky, dirty, and it made me feel like my little victory last night hadn't been a damn thing. I'd humiliated them, sure, but now they were hitting back in ways I couldn't prove. I spent hours cleaning up their messes, scrubbing ketchup off my gnomes, hauling trash to the curb, and every time I did, I felt that fire in my chest flare up again. The cease and desist letter sat on my table, mocking me too. Rick pretending he was the victim while he turned my yard into his dumping ground. I sat down that night with another coffee, staring out at the dark street, my mind racing. The trap had worked once, but it wasn't enough. They'd found a way around it, and I couldn't just sit here taking it. I needed to catch them, really catch them, with something the cameras couldn't miss, something that'd stick, something they couldn't wiggle out of. I didn't know how yet, but as I watched their house, lights flickering behind their curtains, I knew one thing for sure: the worst was still coming. They weren't done with me, and I wasn't done with them. This was a game now, and I was going to play it better. I was starting to feel like a prisoner in my own house, always on edge, waiting for the next pile of garbage or petty jab from Rick and Clarissa. The cat litter had been the tipping point. Shoveling that stinking mess off my porch made me realize I couldn't just keep cleaning up after them. I needed proof, something solid to shove in their faces and end this once and for all. I'd been checking the cameras every day, but they were too smart, sticking to the shadows, hitting the spots where the lenses couldn't reach. I'd underestimated Rick. He wasn't just a loud mouth with a truck, he was cunning in his own nasty way. I sat there one night, coffee in hand, staring out at the dark street, when I saw it. A flicker of movement near the edge of my yard. Not a car this time, but a figure, quick and quiet, slipping through the shadows. My pulse kicked up. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the camera feed, squinting at the grainy image. It was him, Rick. I couldn't see his face clear enough to prove it, but I knew that bulky shape, the way he moved like he owned the place. I watched him creep closer, a sack slung over his shoulder, and my stomach twisted. He wasn't just tossing trash this time, he was up to something worse. I stayed still, barely breathing, letting him think I was asleep or gone. He stopped near what was left of my flower beds, knelt down, and started pouring something out of the sack. It wasn't garbage. It was white, grainy, catching the moonlight, salt. A whole damn bag of it dumped right into the soil. I clenched my fist so hard my knuckles ached. He wasn't just messing with me now. He was poisoning the ground, making sure nothing would ever grow there again. My garden was already wrecked, but this was him spitting on the ashes, trying to kill any chance I had of bringing it back. He worked fast, spreading it thick, then stood up, dusted his hands, and slipped back into the dark toward his house. I sat there shaking with rage, watching him disappear. He thought he'd gotten away clean. He was wrong. I pulled up the camera footage right away, rewinding to the moment he'd stepped into view. There it was clear as day this time. The camera by the garage had caught him dead on, his face lit up by a streetlight as he'd been over with that sack. Rick Dalton, in all his smug glory, salting my earth like some cartoon villain. I saved the clip, my hands trembling not from fear, but from the thrill of finally having him. This wasn't just petty vandalism anymore. This was deliberate, calculated property damage. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my phone and dialed the local police. My voice steady even though my heart was hammering. "Yeah, hi. This is Marcus Shaw on Elm Street," I said when the dispatcher picked up. "I've got video of my neighbor trespassing and ruining my property. He just poured salt all over my yard to kill the soil. I need someone out here now." It didn't take long, maybe 20 minutes before I saw the cruiser roll up, lights off, parking quietly in front of my house. Two officers stepped out, a younger guy with a buzz cut and an older woman with a no-nonsense look. I met them at the door, phone in hand. "Thanks for coming," I said, keeping it short. "I've got it all on camera." They followed me inside, and I played the footage Rick sneaking in, dumping the salt, slinking off. The older cop raised an eyebrow. "That's pretty blatant," she said, jotting something in her notebook. "You know who this is?" "Yeah," I said. "Rick Dalton. Lives 3 houses down. He's been tearing up my yard for weeks with his truck, too. I've got more video if you need it." She nodded. "This'll do for now. Let's go have a word with him." I stayed on my porch, watching as they walked down the street, their flashlights bouncing in the dark. I could see Rick's truck still parked in their driveway, and a light flicked on inside as the cops knocked. The door opened, and there he was, shirtless, looking annoyed until he saw the uniforms. I couldn't hear what they said, but I saw his arms start flailing, his voice rising, probably trying to bluster his way out of it. Then the younger cop stepped forward, calm but firm, and Rick's shoulders slumped. Clarissa appeared behind him, her face pale, clutching that damn robe again. She started yelling too, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "This is ridiculous. You're ruining our family over some dirt?" I just stood there, arms crossed, letting it wash over me. The cops didn't flinch. They talked for a few more minutes. Then Rick stepped outside, hands behind his back. I heard the click of handcuffs, and my chest loosened a little. They walked him to the cruiser, his head down, Clarissa shrieking after them like a banshee. The older cop came back to me while the other loaded Rick into the car. "We're taking him in for trespassing and property damage," she said. That video's solid. You wanna press charges? Damn right I do, I said, no hesitation. She gave me a small nod like she'd expected that. We'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow with the footage. For now, he's spending the night in a cell. I thanked her, and they drove off. Rick's silhouette slumped in the back seat. Clarissa stood on her porch, watching them go, then turned and glared at me, her eyes burning even from that distance. I shrugged just enough for her to see it. Should have thought of that before you ruined my garden, I said loud enough to Carrie. She didn't answer, just spun around and slammed her door. I went back inside, locked up, and sank into my chair, the adrenaline still buzzing in my veins. The yard was a lost cause now, salted and dead, but that didn't matter tonight. I'd caught him, I'd won this round, and they couldn't laugh it off this time. I poured myself a fresh coffee, the steam curling up, and let myself smile. It wasn't over. Clarissa's look told me that much. But for now, I had the upper hand, and it felt good. I woke up the next morning to a quiet street, the kind of stillness that felt almost too good to be true after everything. Rick was gone, hauled off in cuffs the night before, and I figured Clarissa was still reeling from it all. I stepped outside with my coffee, expecting to feel some kind of triumph, but the sight of my yard, the salted soil, the broken fence, dampened it a little. I'd gotten him, sure, but the damage was done. Still, I wasn't about to let that ruin the moment. I sipped my coffee and watched their house, wondering how long it'd take Rick to post bail. Not long, it turned out. By noon, I saw his truck roll back into their driveway, slower than usual, like he was trying not to draw attention. He climbed out, head down, and disappeared inside without a glance my way. Clarissa stepped onto the porch a minute later, pacing like a caged animal, her phone pressed to her ear. I couldn't hear her, but her wild gestures told me she was furious, probably yelling at a lawyer or a friend about how unfair it all was. The neighborhood started buzzing after that. I caught Mrs. Henley, the old lady next door, peering over her fence at me while she watered her plants. Heard the cops were here last night, she said, her voice curious but not pushy. Yeah. I said, keeping it simple. Cut them wrecking my yard on camera. She nodded, a little smile tugging at her lips. Good for you, Marcus. That man's been a minute since he showed up. It wasn't just her. Other neighbors started giving me nods or quick waves when I passed by, like I'd done something they'd all been too polite to try. It felt good knowing I wasn't alone in this, but it didn't last long. That night, around 3 a.m., I jolted awake to a sharp crackling sound outside. I stumbled to the window, rubbing sleep from my eyes, and saw it, flames licking up from my trash can by the curb, a bright orange glow against the dark. My heart sank. I grabbed my phone and ran out in my boxers and a t-shirt, the cold air biting at me as I snatched the garden hose from the porch. The fire wasn't big, mostly paper and leaves, but the smell of burning plastic hit me hard as I sprayed it down. The can was half melted by the time I got the flames out, a charred mesh dripping onto the pavement. I stood there, hose dripping in my hand, breathing fast, the wet grass soaking my bare feet. This wasn't an accident. Someone had lit it, and I didn't need 3 guesses to figure out who. I glanced at their house. Dark, quiet, no sign of life, but I knew Rick might have been licking his wounds. But Clarissa? She was a different kind of mad, the kind that didn't stop. I trudged back inside, soaked and shivering, and pulled up the camera footage. My stomach twisted as I watched a hooded figure, quick and careful, slipping up to the can with a lighter in hand. The angle was off, the face shadowed, but I recognized her shape, the way she moved. Clarissa. She'd stayed just out of the clear frame, dodging the spots where the cameras could nail her. Smart. Too smart. I sat there, staring at the screen, the anger building slow and steady. She'd gone too far now. Arson wasn't a prank, wasn't petty trash tossing. This was dangerous, and I couldn't let it slide. But the footage wasn't enough. Not yet. The cops would call it circumstantial, and she'd wiggle out of it with that smug grin of hers. I needed more, something airtight, but I didn't know how to get it. I spent the next day cleaning up the mess, hauling the ruined can to the garage, my mind racing. Rick stayed out of sight, probably under orders to lay low after his arrest, but Clarissa was everywhere, pacing her porch, glaring at me whenever I stepped outside, her eyes like daggers. The neighbors kept their distance now, whispering among themselves, and I could feel the tension creeping up the street. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I started double-checking the cameras every night, tweaking their angles, hoping to catch her if she tried again. I even set the sprinklers back up just in case Rick got bold, but it was Clarissa I was worried about now. She was unhinged, wilder than I'd ever seen her. Even during the divorce, I'd humiliated her precious Rick, and she wasn't going to let that go. I barely slept, jumping at every sound, my coffee going cold as I sat by the window, watching, waiting. I was ready for a long game. She'd slip up eventually, and I'd be there when she did. But then, out of nowhere, help came knocking. It was late afternoon, the sun dipping low, when I heard a tap on my door. I opened it to find Brielle Knox, the teenage girl from 2 houses over, standing there with her hands in her pockets. She was a quiet kid, always fiddling with that drone of hers, and I'd never talked to her much beyond a wave hello. "Hey, Mr. Shaw," she said, shifting her weight. "I saw what happened with your trash can, and I know who did it." I blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" She glanced over her shoulder, then back at me. "I've got drone footage. Caught her lighting it. Clarissa. She egged my dog's crate last week, and I've been watching her ever since. I'm done with her crap." My jaw dropped. "You've got video?" She nodded, pulling out her phone. "Clear as day. Want it?" I grinned, wider than I had in weeks. "Brielle, you just became my favorite neighbor." She smirked a little, and I knew right then, this was the break I'd been waiting for. Clarissa was done. I stood there on my porch, still reeling from Brielle's visit, my mind buzzing with what she'd just handed me. She'd show me the drone footage on her phone, Granny, at first, but then it zoomed in, clear as daylight. There was Clarissa sneaking out of her house in that hoodie, lighter flickering in her hand as she bent over my trash can. The flames caught quick, and she darted back, glancing around like a nervous cat before disappearing into the shadows. Brielle had caught every second, her drone hovering silent above the street. "I figured you'd want this," she'd said, her voice sharp with her own grudge. "She's been a jerk to everyone, not just you." I'd nodded, barely able to speak, and she'd sent me the file right then and there. "Thanks, Brielle." I'd managed, and she'd shrugged like it was nothing, heading back home with her hands in her pockets. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. I went inside, locked the door, and pulled up the video on my laptop, watching it again, then again. My hands were steady now. No more shaking, just a calm certainty settling in. This wasn't like the camera footage of Rick, blurry and arguable. This was her face, her movements, undeniable. Arson. She crossed a line she couldn't walk back from, and I had her dead to rights. I burned the video to a USB drive, grabbed my jacket, and headed to the police station that afternoon. The same older cop from Rick's arrest was there, her badge reading Officer Grant. She looked up from her desk as I walked in, raising an eyebrow. "Back already, Mr. Shaw?" she said, leaning back in her chair. "Yeah," I said, holding up the drive. "Got something new. Clarissa Dalton this time. She set my trash can on fire the other night, caught it all on video." She took the drive, plugged it into her computer, and watched the footage in silence. I stood there, arms crossed, feeling the weight lift off me with every second she stared at the screen. When it finished, she let out a low whistle. "That's her, all right?" she said, scribbling something on a notepad. "Where'd you get this?" "Neighbor kid with a drone," I said. "She's got her own beef with Clarissa." "Lucky for me." Grant nodded, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Lucky indeed. This is solid. We'll pick her up today." I felt a rush of relief, like I could finally breathe again. "Thanks," I said, and she waved me off. "Just doing the job." "You pressing charges on this one too?" "You bet," I said. No hesitation. She gave me a look, half respect, half amusement, and told me to head home. They'd handle it. I was back on my porch by late afternoon, coffee in hand, when the cruiser rolled up to their house. I watched from a distance, keeping it casual, like I was just enjoying the day. 2 officers, Grant and the younger guy from before, knocked on the door. Clarissa answered, still in that robe, her hair a mess. I couldn't hear the words, but her arms started flailing, her voice rising sharp and loud. "This is insane. You can't do this," she shouted loud enough for me to catch it. Grant stayed calm, saying something I couldn't make out, and then the younger cop stepped forward, cuffs in hand. Clarissa froze, her mouth open, then tried to back inside. They didn't let her. Grant grabbed her arm, gentle but firm, and turned her around. The cuffs clicked, and she started yelling again, a string of curses and pleas that echoed down the street. Rick came barreling out then, his face red, fist clenched. "What the hell's going on?" he roared, stomping toward the cops. I tensed, expecting a fight, but the younger officer moved fast, blocking Rick's path. "Step back, sir," he said, voice hard. Rick didn't listen. He swung an arm, not at the cop but toward me, pointing across the street. "This is you, isn't it, you little bastard?" he bellowed. I didn't move, just sipped my coffee. Meeting his glare, the cop grabbed him, twisting his arm back, and Rick stumbled, swearing as they held him in place. Clarissa was still shrieking, her voice cracking now as they walked her to the cruiser. "He's lying. It's all lies," she cried, but it sounded weak, desperate. The neighbors were out now, Mrs. Henley on her lawn, a couple others peeking through windows, and I could feel their eyes on me, on them. Grant shoved Clarissa into the back seat, slamming the door, while the younger cop kept Rick pinned until he stopped thrashing. "Stay here," he told Rick, then joined Grant in the car. They drove off, Clarissa's muffled yells fading into the distance, leaving Rick standing there, panting, staring at me like he could burn my house down with his eyes. I set my mug down and walked to the edge of my porch, hands in my pockets. Rick took a step toward me. His fists balled up again, but he stopped short, maybe remembering the cops weren't far. "You're dead for this," he growled, low and mean. "Maybe," I said, shrugging, "but she lit the fire, not me. You should have kept her on a leash." His face twisted, and for a second, I thought he'd charge anyway, but he just spat on the ground and stormed back inside, slamming his door so hard the windows rattled. I stood there a minute longer, the street quiet again, the weight of it all sinking in. Clarissa was gone, arrested, locked up, and Rick was stuck, helpless for once. I'd done it, not just a zap or a scare this time. I'd hit them where it hurt. I went back inside, locked up, and sank into my chair, the adrenaline fading into something calmer. The garden was still a wreck, the trash can a melted lump, but none of that mattered right now. I'd taken back control, piece by piece, and they couldn't laugh it off anymore. The fight wasn't over. Rick's glare told me that. But tonight, I'd won, and that was enough. I woke up the next morning to a street that felt different, quieter, heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. Clarissa was gone, locked up on arson charges, and Rick was stuck licking his wounds. I stepped outside with my coffee, expecting to feel some kind of victory, but it was bittersweet. The salted soil stared back at me, a dead patch where my garden used to be, and I couldn't shake the weight of it all. I'd won a battle, sure, but the war had left scars I couldn't ignore. I sipped my coffee and watched their house, the curtains drawn tight, no sign of life. Rick's truck sat in the driveway, still streaked with mud from that night I'd zapped him, and I wondered how long he'd stay quiet. Not long, I figured. He wasn't the type to let this go, not with Clarissa behind bars because of me. The neighborhood had shifted too. Mrs. Henley waved at me from her yard, a little more warmth in it than usual, and I caught a few other neighbors glancing my way, some with nods, some with quick looks before turning away. Word had spread fast. Rick's arrest, Clarissa's meltdown, the whole messy saga. I wasn't sure if they saw me as a hero or just the guy who'd stirred up trouble, but it didn't matter. They weren't glaring at me like I was the problem anymore, and that was something. I spent the day keeping busy, cleaning up the last of the trash can mess, tweaking the cameras just in case. But my mind kept drifting back to Clarissa in that cell, Rick stewing across the street. She'd be out eventually, on bail or probation. And then what? I wasn't naive enough to think this was the end. Weeks passed, slow and tense. Clarissa came back one afternoon, a cab dropping her off in front of their house. I watched from my window as she climbed out, her face hard and cold, no robe this time, just jeans and a jacket, her hair pulled back tight. She didn't look my way, just marched inside, and the door slammed behind her. Rick stepped out a minute later, head down, and I saw the sheriff's deputy parked nearby, probably enforcing the restraining order I'd filed after the fire. He couldn't come near my place now, not legally, and that gave me a little breathing room. But the silence from their house wasn't peace. It was a storm brewing, and I could feel it in my bones. They didn't go out much after that. No porch drinks, no loud truck revving, just a cold, bitter quiet that hung over the cul-de-sac like a fog. Then one night, it broke. I was out front, checking the mail under the streetlights, when I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate. I turned, and there was Rick, stomping across the street, his face twisted with something dark. My stomach tightened, but I stood my ground, hands in my pockets, keeping it casual. He stopped a few feet away, just outside the line, the restraining order said, his fists clenched so tight, I could see the veins popping. "You happy now?" he growled, his voice low and rough. "You destroyed us, you smug little prick." I looked at him, his buzzed hair glinting under the light, his eyes wild, and I felt a flicker of something. Pity, maybe, but not enough to soften me. "I didn't destroy anything," I said, keeping my tone even. "You two did that yourselves? Driving through my yard, salting my garden, setting fires, that's on you." He took a step closer, testing the line, and I tensed, ready to call the cops if he crossed it. "You think you're so smart," he spat, "putting her in jail, ruining everything. We're the laughingstock of this damn street because of you." I shrugged, not taking my eyes off him. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you trashed my life." "I didn't start this, Rick." He opened his mouth, probably to yell, but then something stopped him. A voice, sharp and young, cutting through the dark. "Leave him alone." I turned, surprised, and saw Aiden, Clarissa's 14-year-old son from her first marriage, stepping out from their driveway. I hadn't seen much of him since they moved in. Just a quiet kid who kept to himself, usually glued to his phone or kicking a ball in their backyard. He marched up, his skinny frame tense, his face flushed. Rick spun on him, furious. "Get back inside, kid," he snapped, but Aiden didn't budge. "No," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "You told her to do it. Mom said it was your idea. The fire. All of it. I'm done with this." I stood there stunned as Rick's face went slack, like the air had been punched out of him. "What the hell are you talking about?" he growled, but Aiden didn't back down. "She told me last night, you pushed her to mess with him to get back at him. I heard you." Rick took a step toward him, hand raised like he might grab him, but Aiden flinched away, turning to me instead. "I'm sorry, Mr. Shaw," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought it was just a joke at first. The truck stuff, but it wasn't. I didn't know it'd get this bad. I didn't know what to say." My throat felt tight, caught off guard by this kid standing there, spilling it all. "It's okay, Aiden," I managed. "Takes a lot to say that." He nodded quick and jerky, then turned and walked back to the house, leaving Rick standing there frozen. Rick didn't move for a long moment, his fists unclenching, his shoulders slumping. He looked at me, something broken in his eyes, then muttered, "This ain't over," and trudged back across the street. But it didn't feel like a threat this time. It felt like a man who'd run out of fight. I watched him go, the door slamming behind him, and stood there in the quiet, processing it all. Aiden's words echoed in my head. Rick had pushed her, and now their own kid had turned on them. Their reputation was shot, their family cracking, and I hadn't even had to lift a finger this time. I went back inside, locked up, and sat down with my coffee, the night settling around me. It wasn't joy I felt, not exactly. It was something closer to relief, mixed with a strange ache I couldn't name. They were breaking, and I'd helped make it happen. That was enough for now. I woke up to a morning that felt lighter than any I could remember since Clarissa and Rick moved in. The sun was out, casting long shadows across the street, and their house sat quiet. No truck rumbling, no porch pacing, just stillness. I stepped outside with my coffee, the air crisp with that early fall bite, and looked at my yard. The salted patch was still there, a ugly scar where my garden used to bloom, but it didn't sting as much today. I'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine, Mrs. Henley's whispers mostly that Clarissa and Rick were packing up. The for sale sign went up a week after Aiden's blow-up, and by the end of summer, they were gone. No big goodbye. No last stand. Just a moving truck one night and an empty house the next morning. I stood there, sipping my coffee, staring at the blank windows across the street, and felt something settle in me. Not triumph, exactly, but a kind of peace I hadn't had in months. The days after that stretched into weeks, then months, and the cul-de-sac started to heal. The neighbors came out more. Mrs. Henley puttered in her yard. Brielle flew her drone around. Even the quiet couple down the block started planting flowers of their own. My yard stayed bare for a while, the salt keeping anything from growing, but I wasn't in a rush. I'd sit on my porch every evening, coffee in hand, watching the streets settle into something normal again. I didn't hear much about Clarissa and Rick after they left, just rumors they'd moved to some apartment across town. Still fighting, still bitter. I didn't care enough to dig deeper. They were out of my life, and that was all that mattered. But then, one crisp fall morning, I heard a knock on my door, soft but insistent. I set my mug down, curious, and opened it to find Aiden standing there, a small potted plant in his hands. He looked different. Taller maybe, or just less hunched, his dark hair messy under a baseball cap. "Hey, Mr. Shaw," he said, shifting his weight, his voice quiet but steady. "I brought this for your garden." I blinked, caught off guard, and took the pot. A little marigold, its yellow blooms bright against the green. "Thanks," I said, setting it on the porch railing. "You didn't have to do that." He shrugged, kicking at the step with his sneaker. "I wanted to. We're better now. Different place. Mom's still mad, but she's not, I don't know, crazy like before. I just didn't want you to think we were all like that." I looked at him, this kid who'd stood up to Rick that night, and felt a warmth I hadn't expected. "Takes a lot to say that, Aiden," I said, meaning it. "I appreciate it." He nodded, quick and awkward, then mumbled a goodbye and headed off, his hands shoved in his pockets as he disappeared down the street. I stood there a minute, holding that little plant, and something clicked. I'd spent months fighting, setting traps, chasing proof. Hell, I'd turned my yard into a battlefield just to make them stop. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about moving on. I took the marigold inside, grabbed a shovel, and went to work. The salted spot was still dead, but I dug around it, clearing a new patch near the porch where the soil was clean. I planted Aiden's gift there, patting the dirt down, feeling the earth under my hands again. It wasn't much, just one plant, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, I added more. Daisies, tulips, even a couple rose bushes I picked up cheap at the hardware store. The neighbors noticed. Mrs. Henley brought me some cuttings from her yard, and Brielle started swinging by with her dog, a scruffy mutt named Rusty, to check my progress. "Looks good, Mr. Shaw," she'd say, her drone buzzing overhead, and I'd nod, wiping sweat off my brow. The garden came back slow, piece by piece, and with it, the street felt alive again. I'd sit out there every evening, coffee steaming in the cool air, watching the flowers catch the last light of day. The tire tracks faded, the broken fence got rebuilt, stronger this time, and that salted patch started to soften, grass creeping in where nothing used to grow. It wasn't the same as before. Couldn't be, not after everything. But it was mine again, and that was enough. Brielle became a regular visitor, her dog flopping in my yard while she told me about school or her latest drone tricks. "Caught a raccoon on video last night," she'd say, grinning, and I'd laugh, feeling lighter than I had in years. Mrs. Henley started calling me over for tea sometimes, and I'd go, listening to her ramble about her grandkids, the quiet settling into something comfortable. One night, as the leaves turned golden red, I sat on my porch, mug warm in my hands, looking out at the garden. It wasn't perfect. Some plants were scraggly, others still small, but it was growing, steady and sure. I thought about Clarissa and Rick, about the chaos they'd brought, the nights I'd spent angry and sleepless. I'd fought hard to make it stop, and I'd won, not with fists or yelling, but with patience, with proof, with people like Brielle and Aiden stepping up when I least expected it. I didn't hate them anymore. Didn't need to. They were gone, and I was still here, my little house quiet, my lawn untouched. I took a sip of coffee, the bitterness familiar and good, and let out a long breath. The fight was over, and the flowers were back. Sometimes, I realized, it's not about revenge. It's just about taking back what's yours and letting the rest go.